After 40 years of marriage, my husband looked me straight in the eyes and said he regretted marrying me. There was no anger in his voice, no guilt, just a strange sense of relief. I didn't argue or cry. That same night, he picked up my old diary by accident. 10 minutes later, he collapsed to the floor. For 4 decades, I was the quiet woman beside him, the one who kept the house running, remembered anniversaries, and smiled in front of relatives. People called our marriage strong. They didn't know that strength sometimes looks like silence. Daniel often reminded me how much he had sacrificed for me, his dreams, his freedom, his youth. Every time he said it, I nodded. I learned long ago that nodding was safer than speaking. The words finally came on an ordinary evening. He was stirring his tea when he said it, calmly as if reading a line from a book. He told me he had wasted his life and that if he had another chance, he would never choose me again. I felt something inside me go completely still. I asked him if that was all. He said I deserved the truth. That was the moment I realized he believed the truth could only hurt me, never him. That night, after he went to sleep, I sat alone in the living room. Memories I had buried for years slowly came back, the insults I ignored, the betrayals I pretended not to see, the parts of myself I erased to keep peace. In the storage cabinet behind old blankets and broken things, there was a small wooden box locked. Forgotten. Inside it was my diary. I started writing it when I was young, back when I still believed words could protect me. I wrote only on nights when speaking felt dangerous. I never wrote to plan revenge. I wrote to stay sane. Every entry had a date. Every truth was written carefully. Names, times, excuses, and lies, things Daniel believed no one noticed. Things he believed I had forgotten. The next morning I placed the diary on the coffee table. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say a word. I simply went out for a walk. When I returned, the house felt wrong, too quiet. Daniel was sitting on the floor, the diary open in his trembling hands. His face was pale, and his lips were moving as if he was trying to speak but couldn't. He had reached the chapter I wrote after forgiving him in public and documenting him in private. He looked up at me with fear in his eyes and asked if it was all true. I didn't answer. I just watched him turn the next page, slowly realizing that I had never been weak, only patient. He read in silence for a long time. The clock on the wall kept ticking, loud enough to feel like it was counting something down. His hands shook as if the diary were burning him, yet he couldn't put it down. Every few seconds his eyes widened, then narrowed, then filled with something close to panic. I stayed near the doorway, not speaking, not moving, letting the truth do what my voice never could. The early pages were gentle. He almost smiled at those, I think. They spoke of hope, of effort, of a young woman trying very hard to be enough. Then the tone changed. The dates moved forward and the words grew quieter but sharper. I had written about the first lie I caught him in, and how I convinced myself it didn't matter. About the first time he embarrassed me in front of others, and how I laughed to protect him. About the night I realized love could exist without kindness. He turned another page and stopped breathing for a moment. I recognized that entry immediately. It was the one I wrote after I followed him without meaning to. I hadn't planned to. I was just tired of wondering. I wrote down where he went, who he met, how long he stayed. I didn't write how much it hurt. I wrote only what I saw. Facts are harder to deny. Daniel's mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to interrupt the past. He looked at me again, searching my face for denial, for mercy. I gave him neither. I had learned long ago that explaining myself only helped him feel innocent. The diary didn't accuse him. It didn't insult him. That was the cruelest part. It simply recorded him, his words, his actions, his patterns. It showed how often he apologized and how quickly he repeated himself. How he blamed stress. Work me. How I accepted every excuse out loud and questioned none of them on paper. He flipped faster now, like someone hoping to reach a different ending if he hurried. The pages described years he thought were erased. Conversations he believed I had forgotten. Promises he assumed no longer mattered. There were entries about dinners where he praised other women while I sat beside him smiling. Entries about nights he came home late and mornings he left early without explanations. I didn't know, he whispered, his voice breaking. I almost laughed at that. Instead, I remained silent. The diary went on to describe the day he told me I was lucky he stayed. I had written how I thanked him and then cried alone in the bathroom. The page after that listed every time he used the word regret, casually, jokingly, as if it were harmless. Seeing it all together made it heavy. Even for him. His breathing grew uneven. He pressed his hand against his chest as if something inside him was trying to escape. Still, he kept reading. People often do when the truth finally starts making sense. They want to know how deep it goes. The later entries were calmer, colder. That was when I stopped hoping he would change and started observing him instead. I wrote less about pain and more about clarity. I wrote about realizing that patience, when misunderstood, can look like weakness, and how useful that misunderstanding can be. Daniel reached the section where my handwriting became more precise. Measured. His eyes slowed down. He noticed the lists. Dates circled, notes in the margins, cross-references. Things I had connected quietly over time. Not plans, just understanding. The kind that takes years to form. He stood up suddenly as if the floor had betrayed him. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, almost pleading. I looked at him and finally spoke. "You never listened." That answer seemed to hit harder than anything he read. He sat back down, weaker now. He turned another page and froze. This was the part where I wrote about the day I stopped defending him to myself. The day I accepted him exactly as he was. Not with love, with accuracy. I watched his face as realization slowly replaced shock. He wasn't afraid of what I felt anymore. He was afraid of what I knew. Of how long I had known it. Of how carefully I had stayed quiet. The diary described moments he thought were victories. Times he believed he had won arguments, controlled outcomes, shaped our life to his advantage. Seeing those same moments through my calm, unreactive words stripped them of their power. They didn't look impressive anymore. They looked small. Predictable. His voice dropped to a whisper. What did you do with all this? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He turned to the next page and his hands started shaking again. This entry was different, shorter. Written years after the rest. He read it twice. Then a third time. His face drained of color, and he pressed his palm against his chest again, breathing hard. No, he said quietly. You wouldn't. I took a step closer, not to comfort him. Just close enough for him to feel my presence. He looked up at me, eyes wide. Finally understanding that the woman he thought he had outgrown had been watching him mature into his own consequences. He flipped the page slowly, as if hoping the words would change. They didn't. His breathing turned shallow. His fingers slipped and the diary fell open to the next entry, the one I had never planned for him to read so soon. That was when his knees buckled. I didn't rush forward. I didn't call his name. I simply stood there, listening to the sound of 40 years finally catching up to him, knowing the story was far from over. He didn't fall all the way to the ground. He caught the edge of the table, gasping, as if the air itself had turned against him. The diary lay open near his feet, the pages exposed like a witness that refused to be silenced. I watched his struggle without panic. For years I had imagined this moment without knowing it. What it would look like when the truth stopped being theoretical and became physical. Sit down, I said quietly. He obeyed. That alone told me how much had shifted. Daniel had never taken instructions from me before. Not really. He sat on the couch, hunched, older than he had ever looked. His eyes kept drifting back to the diary as if it might move on its own. He reached for it again, then pulled his hand back, afraid of what the next page might demand from him. I thought you forgot, he said. You always forgave. I did forgive, I replied. That doesn't mean I erased. He swallowed hard and finally picked it up again. His confidence was gone now. He read slowly, carefully, like someone handling something fragile and dangerous at the same time. The entry spoke of conversations he remembered differently. Moments where he thought he had won, but I had simply stopped fighting. The contrast unsettled him more than anger ever could. The diary recorded how I learned his habits, how he lied differently when he was tired, how his voice changed when he felt cornered, how predictable he became when he thought I was powerless. I had written these things without emotion, the way one might document weather patterns. Over time, patterns tell stories of their own. Daniel rubbed his temples. Why keep all this? I answered truthfully. So I wouldn't doubt myself. That sentence landed heavy. For years, doubt had been his favorite tool. He questioned my memory, my reactions, my understanding of events. The diary proved I had seen clearly all along. That frightened him more than accusation ever could. He turned to another section and stiffened. This was when I began writing about other people. Not names at first, just descriptions. Who spoke to him a little too warmly. Who avoided looking at me. Who knew more about our life than they should have. I didn't draw conclusions. I didn't need to. The timeline spoke for itself. I didn't think you noticed, he murmured. I noticed everything, I said. I just chose when to respond. His breathing grew uneven again. He pressed the diary closed, then opened it back up, as if trying to control the pace of his own unraveling. The later pages were the hardest for him. That was when I stopped writing daily and began writing strategically. Short entries, precise language, observations without context, like pieces waiting to be assembled. Daniel's hands shook as he reached one of the final sections. He hadn't expected that part. Neither had I once. Those entries were written after something in me changed permanently. After regret stopped hurting and started clarifying. I don't understand, he said. Why now? I let the silence stretch. Silence had taught me more than any argument ever had. Finally I spoke. You said you regretted marrying me. That meant you were done pretending, so was I. He looked at me with something close to desperation. What did you mean when you wrote this? He pointed to a sentence I remembered well. It was simple, almost harmless on its own. But paired with the dates, the notes, the quiet preparation behind it, it meant something else entirely. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Explanation would soften it. I wanted clarity. Daniel stood up again, pacing now. The diary clenched in his hand. You could destroy me, he said half to himself. I met his eyes. You already did that, I just documented it. That was when he understood the real shift. This wasn't about revenge fueled by anger. This was about control returning to its rightful place. He had always believed control belonged to the louder voice, the stronger presence. He was wrong. Control belongs to the one who can wait. He stopped pacing and looked around the house, as if seeing it for the first time. The walls, the furniture, the life we built. He realized how much of it depended on the version of me he had underestimated. His voice cracked. I walked over and gently took the diary from his hands. He didn't resist. I closed it slowly, deliberately. I already did it, I said. You're just catching up. His face drained of color again. He opened his mouth to ask another question, but no words came out. The man who had spoken so easily about regret now struggled to form a sentence. That imbalance was not accidental. I placed the diary back on the table, exactly where it had been before. The difference was that now it weighed something. Not just paper and ink, but awareness, accountability, fear. Daniel sank back onto the couch, defeated in a way I had never seen. He wasn't angry anymore. He was calculating, trying to understand how many people knew, how much time had passed, how far the consequences might reach. Those thoughts chased each other across his face, faster and faster. I trusted you? He said weakly. I nodded. That was your mistake. The room fell quiet again. The clock kept ticking. Outside, life continued normally, unaware that something irreversible had begun inside these walls. Daniel stared at the diary one last time, as if hoping it would disappear if he looked away long enough. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know when. He only knew one thing now, with absolute certainty. The woman he regretted marrying had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. And I hadn't even reached the final page yet. Daniel sat frozen, the diary lying open on the table. His hands shook as he realized that every memory he had distorted, every excuse he had whispered himself had been carefully recorded. Every action, every betrayal, every careless word, meticulously catalogued in my diary. I walked slowly toward him, each step measured, as if the house itself had grown heavier with all the truths it had silently witnessed over the years. You thought I was weak, I said softly, letting my words cut through the thick silence. You thought patience meant submission. You thought forgiveness meant I had nothing left. He looked up at me, desperation in his eyes. I didn't know, I thought. His voice faltered. He wasn't used to being caught like this, stripped of the narrative he had believed controlled everything. I didn't interrupt him. I let him struggle with the realization. 40 years of arrogance and self-assurance had been reduced to nothing by a quiet, persistent truth. The diary had spoken where I couldn't. You documented me, he said finally, a tremor in his voice. Every time, everything. You remembered it all. Yes, I said. I remembered, I waited, I planned. And now you understand that your version of life wasn't the only one. It wasn't even accurate. He stared at me as though seeing me for the first time in decades. The woman beside him, the one he thought he had shaped, controlled, and even belittled, was gone. What remained was something sharper, stronger, and unyielding. You don't understand, he said, shaking his head. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it, I didn't know. I smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was slow, deliberate, and ice-cold. Sorry isn't enough, I said. 40 years of words, actions, and intentions can't be erased with a simple apology. You spent decades controlling the narrative, believing you were right. I simply waited for the right moment to reveal the truth. He tried to speak, tried to regain the upper hand, but the weight of the diary and everything it contained kept him silent. For the first time, he realized that control was not about force or dominance. It was about foresight, patience, and understanding the depth of another person's mind, and he had been blind to it all. I picked up the diary, running my fingers across the worn cover. Do you understand now? I asked softly. He nodded, a slow, trembling movement. Yes, he whispered. I've been wrong. Wrong doesn't fix it, I said, but understanding is the first step. I opened the diary to the final pages, the ones I had written years ago but had never let him see until now. Every secret, every observation, every tiny act of betrayal or neglect laid bare. I read a few lines aloud, the words cutting through the air like a scalpel. Daniel flinched, covering his face. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He had to confront the truth. Do you see now? I asked. Do you see the life you lived? Do you see the choices you made and the person you were? And now, do you understand what it feels like to be powerless while someone else observes every move, every mistake, and waits? He didn't answer. The silence was his confession. He had no excuses left, no rationalizations. He had been caught entirely in the web of his own actions, and he knew it. I closed the diary gently and set it on the table. I never wanted to destroy you, I said. I wanted you to see, to feel the weight of truth, to understand that patience is not weakness, that forgiveness is not submission, that being underestimated can be the most powerful weapon of all. Daniel looked at me, tears in his eyes, pale and broken. I don't know what to say, he whispered. There's nothing to say, I said. The words have already been spoken. The diary has already done its work. You will carry this knowledge for the rest of your life, and that is your punishment. He sank into the couch, exhausted, silent, finally recognizing the woman he had always dismissed. He saw clearly now that I had never been powerless, I had only been patient. I had waited until he underestimated me entirely, until the moment was perfect to reveal all truths in their purest, most undeniable form. You underestimated me, I said, my voice calm but firm. You assumed 40 years of marriage gave you dominance, control, superiority. But you forgot one thing: patience is a strategy and knowledge is a weapon. He looked at me as though trying to memorize the words, trying to make them permanent in his memory. He had never faced someone who understood him so completely, someone who had observed him with such precision and clarity. And now he could not deny it. I understand, he said finally, but his voice was weak. I understand everything. I nodded, satisfied. Good understanding is step one. But now you live with it. You live with the knowledge of every choice you made and every pain you caused. That is the reality of underestimating someone quietly, patiently, and wisely. He lowered his head, defeated. For the first time in decades, he felt small, not because anyone had humiliated him, but because the truth had made him confront his own failures. And that was the most powerful punishment of all. I turned and walked toward the door, leaving him with the diary. With the weight of every word, every memory, every truth laid bare. I didn't need to stay. The story had reached its conclusion. Daniel would never be the same, and neither would our marriage. The balance of power had shifted permanently, invisibly but undeniably. Years of quiet observation, patience, and intelligence had led to this moment. No one had been hurt physically, but the psychological shift was complete. He had seen his life from my perspective, and the realization of his own arrogance and blindness was more devastating than any revenge could ever have been. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. I had lived decades in silence, recording every truth, and now, finally, the truth had spoken. The diary had done its work, and I had achieved what no words, no arguments, no confrontations ever could. I had given him the clarity to face himself, and I had reclaimed my power. Daniel remained inside, staring at the diary, trembling, haunted, knowing that for the first time in his life, he was powerless against the quiet intellect and long patience of the woman he had spent 40 years underestimating. And that was the ending he could never rewrite.